Hello and welcome back to Stories Across Borders. For those of you who are new, here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums, books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only talk about these things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, art, or mechanics is out unless it directly relates to the way the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford, author, Invisible Spectre looming over your shoulder, and also your host. And I'm joined once more by my regular co-conspirator, John Kernan.
Hi guys. I hope you're a big fan of hot books.
Wow. Okay. That's one way to lead into this, I guess. John is also responsible for the chosen subject matter of this episode, that being The Book Thief, originally a book by author Marcus Zusak, and later adapted into a film in 2013.
A book where I cannot actually say the title is misleading, and yet it made me imagine something so different from what it actually is.
Honestly. Apologies in advance if you hear the wind blowing inside. There's really nothing I can do about that. It's just decided at this moment to pick up. So, that out the way, we will probably be focused more on the book compared to the movie, since going by the notes, I feel like it's going to do a better job of highlighting the narrator than the film would anyway, since narration and perspective are, of course, the focus for this cycle. But also, I haven't seen the movie.
Yeah. The movie did quite a good job, but I would even say it nailed the narration, but there's much less of it. Most of the time it's just being a movie. And he pops in every now and then, like you expect from a narrator in a movie.
As opposed to the book, where our narrator is telling the entire story, because that's how a book works.
Yeah, and it does a really interesting thing, too, that I actually forgot to bring up on my own when we were talking about all the different kinds of narration. He does something you don't see very often, and that's that kind of narration where it's like, the narration is still kind of limited. It's not quite omniscient, but the story is being told both from the perspective of the narrator themselves and still at least partially the perspective and feelings of the main character. Because he's still constantly talking about the way Liesel looks at things and the way Liesel feels about things and all that.
It's because it's a second-hand account.
Yeah,
Other than a handful of times where he was actually there, it's going by the information from Liesel's diary, basically. On that note, though, we should probably backtrack a little bit.
That's true.
The Book Thief is a story about Liesel Memminger, a young girl
Yeah.
who lives during Nazi Germany who lives in Nazi Germany during World War II. And we follow her through 4 years of her life, from the age of 10 to the age of 14. It's a little bit older. I think it's like 12 to 16 in the film, whatever.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah, what a time to be alive. We learn about the very harsh life she has had to live under the rule of Hitler. But here's the kicker. The story is not narrated by Liesel. The narrator is a third party who comes across Liesel and observes her in person 3 times. And the rest they are going by her diary, which they have found. And the narrator is Death.
Yeah, we get a very, very wonderful line early on. I can't remember it word for word, but we get the lovely kicker of, and you will know me eventually too.
Yeah. Yeah, Death is so matter-of-fact about things. They are a fascinating character in their own right. I think they're personified as male, actually, but...
Kinda, but also not necessarily. I think it's more like in this, Death has a more masculine, like, bend.
Yeah.
And attitude, and yes, is voiced by a man in the audiobook in the movie, but, death is death.
Yeah, fair. But yeah, very, very interesting character, and a very interesting lens to view Liesel's story through, given the events in it and the time and location she is living in.
Yeah, besides the actual lines we get, my favorite thing that's unique about having Death as the narrator is how often when we meet a character, he will just nonchalantly bring up how they're gonna die because that's the next time he sees them.
Yeah.
After they leave that chunk of the story.
That's one of the things. Like it's very the way Death narrates is very conversational. It's like having a conversation with somebody, and just like with a conversation, it doesn't follow a completely logical linear path. Sometimes a character will pop up and Death will tangent into them a little bit and be like, "Oh yeah, that guy, he dies like this," and then we'll sort of backtrack and go, "Right, we're not up to that yet."
Yeah, and I really I don't want to say I love descriptions of how people die, but I do love the descriptions of how Death finds them and takes them away, because each description is so personal to the person that's happening. Like a young boy who got tangled up in barbed wire and froze to death, and Death describes gently untangling him, taking him into his arms, carrying him somewhere warm where they can both sit and relax for a while.
Yeah, the moments where Death is taking the souls are there's an intimacy to it. And because we are looking at the story through Death's eyes, through the lens of Death as a character, we get to know Death as well as Liesel, whose story he is recounting.
Yeah, it's nice. He has this weird air of like both deeply emotional and also professionally detached, because he's doing his job, and everybody has to die eventually, and he obviously has seen more people die than anybody else ever. So he can't be that emotional about death, but also he kind of likes people. He doesn't want them to, he doesn't, for the most part, want them to hurt or suffer, and most of the time he just finds them interesting. But he sees people he likes, and the first thing he tells us about Liesel is that he became fascinated with her from the very first time he saw her.
Yeah. The thing with Death, right, is that it's not just like a professional detachment. It is, in the way it presents, Death has a very professional demeanor about their work. It has to be done, and they're the only one that can do it. But they don't necessarily like it. Like, it's not just detaching themselves for professional reasons. They are genuinely unnerved and put off by the grief, by human grief. They struggle to deal with it and upsets them, and that's why they don't linger, and they look to anything else they can. They take in the colors of the environment and focus on that, so they don't have to watch the human grief that they don't understand or know how to pass, because they are eternal.
Yeah, to the point where Death practically apologizes for being interested in people. Like, I think you get the line of like, you have to understand, I wasn't trying to keep popping up around this person. I kept trying to do anything else, and yet I couldn't seem to stay away.
Yeah. That's what the things like Liesel is interesting to Death, but Death isn't going out of his way to haunt Liesel. Quite the opposite. Death would quite like to let this poor girl have an ordinary life, but people keep dying around her, so they keep crossing paths. And eventually, one day, as a compulsion, he picks up this diary that she's dropped and left behind and keeps it. And reads it and learns about her and then recounts her story to us. Which is, again, just a very interesting way to do narration in general.
Yeah, he is literally narrating a book to us.
It's kind of like a twist on that sort of narration trope you sometimes come across, where it's like the narrator talks about this big, like a long gone legend, a thing that's faded to history, let me tell you about it, you know. It's kind of like a twist on that almost, where it's like, these are events that happened, I wasn't there for all of it, but I have this recount, and now I'm going to share it with you.
Yeah, and honestly, it's always one of my favorite forms of narration.
The thing that
Other than the
oh, go.
other than the fact that he's presented as a character, Death here actually has a lot in common with a more mature version of the narration in the Chronicles of Narnia. It is someone telling you a story directly and personally, with all the little side accounts and meanderings and even occasional outright distractions that come along with it.
Yeah, it feels like someone has like learned about something interesting, and they're like telling you about it, sitting across from you at the table at dinner, or at the pub, or just at work. I think that's what I said earlier on. It has a very conversational feel to it, but it makes me wonder, like, because it's not Death's story. It's this other story that Death is enamored with for their own bizarre reasons. It makes you wonder the motivation Death has for sharing that story.
Yeah,
And
it almost makes you wonder what the context in is, because obviously we have a book right in front of us, but realistically, how would Death be telling a story, and to who?
yeah, I mean, suspension of disbelief, even though we have, Marcus Suzak's name on the front of the book.
Or maybe that's just Death's pen name.
Maybe. Death lives in Sydney. But suspension of disbelief, we're supposed to believe that what we're reading is Death's recount of this faded diary, basically. But Death never, like, explicitly tells us why he is sharing this story. At least I don't remember anything like that. So you're kind of left to wonder about the motivations, because
Yeah, it's really interesting.
it's because it's simultaneously a warning and a rumination and a question. Death doesn't understand us. As afraid as we are of death, we unnerve Death as well, and it feels. And like, Death is trying to almost process things through Liesel's story, is what it feels like.
And both because being mortal is so different from being eternal, and being a person is so different from being a concept, but like, more than anything, humans are so volatile and change so much. Like, death could never get a grip on us anyways, because by the time Death might think like they understand everything about us, in what is a single drop in the passage of time to Death, the entire course of humanity changes. But at the same time, Death sees us do the same things over and over and over again. That perfect simultaneous contrast of everything changes, and the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, humanity perplexes Death because we're so different, and Death deals with that grief, but also watches societies inflict that grief upon each other all the time, which is, again, it's so strange. But the thing we have to remember is, like, Death is still Death as well, so you're getting this Death is still very matter of fact about all these things because he is so eternal, because he is watching all this. So he talks in a way where it's like, yeah, this is going to happen. This happens again. It's not surprising that this is happening again. I don't like it. I'm not thrilled, but here we go. Simultaneously, they feel like a person, but also very inhuman in the way they think, because of who they are, what their role is, and how long they have persisted. They don't feel the same way about dying as people do, and yet, in some ways, that as much as we fear death is put off by us, because there is just this insurmountable barrier there.
Yeah. Why do we do the things we do? Why do we seem to have, for instance, such a strong, intense fear of death, and yet constantly do things that are practically running straight at it?
Yeah, it's to death. We are that We are that intrusive thought that gets lodged in your brain and just keeps coming back, bothering you. It'll subside sometimes, and then a couple years later, suddenly it's back just as strong as ever, and you've got to go through it all over again. That's what we are to death. We are alien and abstract and bizarre and nonsensical, to the point where there's a very poignant line, the very last line in the book even, where Death says, "I am haunted by humans, because the things we do and our irrationality disturb Death."
Yeah, it's like, it must be frustrating to be something that for all intents and purposes is above us and intimately interacts with us all the time, always has throughout history, as long as we've existed, watching us, taking us, passing us on, and yet still not really be able to understand us, because Death is the inquisitive type. Death isn't the type to say, well, it doesn't make sense, screw it, who cares, it's just because it doesn't make sense. Death can't help but want to know, because Death meets us all eventually. Every single one of us. And that's something that is never going to change. That will always be its role, its job. And so, Death, despite our peculiarities, is completely, not always completely engrossed with us, but always invested.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, Death is all, like, as much as we disturb Death and as much as we fear Death, Death is enamored with us because we are intrinsically and irrevocably linked. So, of course, Death is interested in us and occasionally becomes interested in our stories, even though it drives him mad and even causes him grief and like the confusion and secondhand sadness of dealing with human grief as a result of the things he must do.
Especially because with the way the story is told, it feels particularly like Death can't see really any individual people all the time. Death only goes where Death is for the most part and sees the people around it, which is why the most detailed descriptions of anything not directly related to Liesl's story that we get in the book are when Death talks about the things happening in war. Because there is nothing Death gets to see in more detail than war, even for the people who don't die, because Death gets to see the things around Death, too. And there is always death in war.
And always a lot of death in war. He gets to hang around in a single location longer because so many people die at the same time in those locations.
Basically, non-stop overtime.
Yeah.
To the point where that's actually the one time Death does sound actually detached. Such intense descriptions of, like, whenever Death talks about collecting someone's soul in other parts of the book. When Death is talking about war, the description literally changes to shoveling the souls up into a heap.
Because he has to. There's too many. He can't gently take them one by one. That's not a luxury afforded to him during the war times. And again,
which I think actually makes for a beautiful metaphor about how, like, their death in war is not a glorious or a beautiful thing, and it's so mulchy and awful that, like, it even takes away that little bit of warmth and kindness that you're supposed to have at the end.
Well, I mean, it's like I'm probably gonna not get it exactly right, but it's the Stalin quote, isn't it? One death is a tragedy, 100 deaths or 1,001 million, whatever is a statistic. Because it has to be. We can't process death at that scale and numbers like that as well in our brains. We can't form the attachment like we can to a single face and name and story. And for Death, it has to be that way, is the difference. He has to detach himself a bit and just get on with the job. He doesn't want to. He wishes he could give people the proper care they deserve. He is not without emotions. He has people he likes and dislikes and scenes he likes and dislikes. You know? And he has to switch off and just do the job and trudge through it and becoming exhausted, just work through it to get it done during times of war.
And there was no time of war more that must have been more tiring and maybe even more depressing for Death than the 2 world wars.
Yeah, I mean, they were unprecedented in scale and the technologies that were unleashed, and like they marked a very huge shift, each one more than the last, in what warfare is like, and in the way we deal with mass destruction, mass casualties, and things like that. Worth noting, by the way, just as a side tangent, talk about things like Death's feelings. Death does hate Hitler, which I appreciate.
Even Death.
Yeah, Death goes out of his way at one point to like stand on a broken portrait of Hitler that has landed on the floor after a bombing and walk over it. Which, I mean, say what you will about Death, he's clearly got good moral character.
Yeah. Yeah, it's...
But of course he doesn't like the people who hasten to send people en masse into his grasp, because it causes him suffering. Not only is it exhausting for him, but he can't deal with human grief, and he has to deal with so much of it, and none of it makes any sense why it's happening. So yeah, he's really fucking bothered by it.
Hitler's doing more than just send a bunch of extra souls Death's way. Those souls are going through a lot of extra suffering along the way, too.
And Death has to shoulder all of that when he carries them on.
Yeah, it's like, you almost actually get the feeling that Death is avoiding talking about it in a part of the story early on where it mentions that the town is not that far away from Dachau, the camp.
Yeah.
It mentions it so offhandedly and moves on very quick. I think Death's probably not a fan of places like that.
Well, it's interesting because he talks a lot at a couple of points about Auschwitz and the other death camps. The death camps fucking disgust Death. The idea of, rounding these people up, jamming them in to give them a shower, and it's a slow, horrific death that didn't need to happen. It wasn't in combat. It's not on the war field. It's just slaughter with no purpose, and that disgusts him.
It's as unnatural and pointless as Death possibly gets. A perversion of Death's very existence.
Exactly, and it's things like that are why Death looks at humanity, and as intrigued as he is, he's also disturbed.
Why would we do this?
Yeah, Death makes for such a interesting voice to listen to, an interesting lens to view this very horrific time, and it's just a very poignant, layered character. And it's wild because we become so enraptured by Death at times. Well, there's a sentence. That we forget that this isn't Death's story, and it's not like Liesel is not an interesting character, or her friends are not interesting characters. Hans and Liesel and Rudy and Ilsa, especially Ilsa for me. She is my favorite character, other than maybe Death.
Ilsa is great. I love Rudy. It's pretty lame by comparison, since he's obviously a very present in the story and you were supposed to like him, but outside of Death, I have a special place in my heart for Hans.
Because he's such
an
person.
Interesting man. Like, he is, and he's also got so many layers too. He's such a kind, gentle, soft man, but he also has this understated, very subtle strength underneath that only comes out when absolutely necessary, partially because he's also a little bit of a broken man.
Yeah, I mean,
he's very tired.
He has been through hell in World War I. He understands, and he can see the suffering that these people, like the Jews and others, are getting put through.
Hans Huberman has escaped from me multiple times. Once during the First Great War, we seemed to keep passing each other over and over again, but never scheduled a meeting. I get the feeling he wasn't excited to meet.
Yeah, I mean, that sums him up quite nicely. He loves life, and he hates seeing it twisted and perverted, and taken and stolen, and it tires
so
him out.
funny.
And he fears for the people, not just himself, but for the people around him, and he is willing to shoulder responsibility and put himself at risk, despite all that, to try and protect people. I think of all the characters in the story, Hans and Death have probably the most in common in a lot of ways.
That's true. There's a lot of overlap there. It's always funny to watch through the way Hans reacts to different scenes. It's very easy for him to seem like he doesn't want to do anything other than be the nice guy at first. I think the story does such a good job of pacing and following specifically Liesel, because we are still seeing things through her eyes, like we said earlier, as Death is telling us the story, to the point where it seems, when she first gets there, like Hans is just the spineless nice guy who won't stand up to anybody, including his seemingly abusive, constantly angry wife, and his wife, who seems to do nothing but yell and threaten and be selfish, and almost seems like she only...
Every second word out of her mouth is an expletive.
Especially Zaumensch.
Yeah.
And how it seems as if she only let Liesel come in to get the allowance, which I do have to say, although I don't mind the book doing it, is one change I like that they made in the movie. The movie never tells you that she loves Liesel. They wait until you get to the point where Liesel has realized it, and you can see the love in how she acts. The book tells you almost right away, listen, I know she's really mean, but she does love her.
Yeah, I mean, Death makes a point of saying, toward the end of the book, you might think that, oh god, I've just forgotten her name for a second. It was,
I was forgetting her name too, to be honest, which I feel bad about, because I was just listening to the book again last night.
It's, you can hear me typing, I'm Googling it.
Oh no.
Open the wiki, let's go.
Miss Huberman.
Rosa,
that's right. Oh, I see, I was being dyslexic. The name Sora kept popping up into my head, and I was like, that's not her name.
That's not German.
That's literally just... Brain literally just flipped 2 letters and was like, this is fine.
Famous Nazi German Sora from Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah. Isn't that one of the Disney worlds?
Anyway,
there's a cartoon where Donald shows up in a Nazi uniform. Yeah. Sora could go somewhere black and white with lots of... Okay, well, so back to Death and springtime for Hitler in Germany.
Yeah, was saying, Death sort of says, draws our attention to this, right? It sort of says, I bet you might be thinking that Rosa is a bad person, but then he points out that she accepted a Jewish man into her house during the Holocaust and fed him and cared for him, no questions.
While they were poor and barely scraping by enough to even feed themselves something as simple as awful tasting, badly cooked pea soup every day.
And whilst it's true, we do know that she was getting paid to have Liesel.
It wasn't much.
It wasn't much, and it's never said that that's the reason.
Yeah.
And that's
exactly. In fact, like, you would seem it almost seems like it would just be her arrogance and not wanting to look bad, but no, we get to see Rosa's genuine offense whenever somebody either hints that they think that is her reason, or even just hints that should be her reason and that should be good enough. She gets upset,
and that's a sight to behold.
Yeah, you don't get to see her actually upset that often. She's one of those people who seems upset most of the time, but that's just that's just how she is.
When
She's a fiery and admittedly abrasive person.
Yeah, I mean, when she's at her most upset and heartbroken is when she's silent.
Yeah, that's the funny thing is loud is just her normal. Both when she's very happy and when she's very angry, she gets quiet. Like the one time we get to see that Hans felt bad about getting something for just Liesel, and he went out and rolled and sold even more of his cigarette ration to bring home eggs for Rosa to cook with.
And
She's got nothing to say, just goes to happily humming to herself as she cooks.
And that's one of the things that's so good about this book in general. Like, all the characters are so tangible and real and believable. Like, they're not just tonally consistent with this portrayal of Nazi Germany, of that world, but they feel like true people. They are layered and complex. They have strengths and weaknesses. They're flawed. They always feel like someone you might meet, that you could meet in person and go, wow, you're just like this person.
Which is perfect, because death does meet them all. Eventually.
Exactly. And that's something I want to draw attention to as far as the narration goes, because we get contrast. Because we have Death telling us Liesel's story, we spend a lot of this time hearing about these characters and learning about them through Liesel's eyes, as described by Death. But then we get contrasting points from Death himself outside of that, where he will confirm or deny something that Liesel says, or bring attention to something that is present but not actively drawn attention to otherwise in Liesel's recounting of events. Like things like, yeah, you might think this woman was abrasive and horrible, but look how truly kind she actually was. And look at these moments that Liesel experienced and saw, and recontextualize and think about them for a moment. Similarly, though, we know that we know early on that Ilsa is, before Liesel talks about it, Death goes, it never even occurred to Liesel, that maybe Ilsa is letting her steal these books.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. She thinks she's so sneaky.
And then we have characters like Hans, and Death does something different with some characters, especially with Hans, where it's like Death confirms Liesel's worldview, and we know that the way that Liesel sees Hans is true. That's just how good a person he really is.
It's who he is through and through, beginning to the end, to the point where in probably the greatest, most violent and brutal death toll of all time, an entire platoon of soldiers who all know with almost certainty that they are walking straight to death the next time they leave, would volunteer Hans to be the one who stays.
Yeah, and Death goes out of his way to tell us about this, because he wants us to know that what Liesel is saying about Hans is true.
Yeah, that part of the story, I was so caught off guard by. Like, I wasn't surprised at all when they're like, yeah, Hans's friend here, he volunteers him. He says, yeah, Hans should be the one to stay and write these letters. And then immediately after he does that, everyone else starts saying it. And I'm like, oh, they didn't talk about these other guys much, but they clearly all must have some respect for him, because this very much seems like a, hey, you're the only one who is guaranteed to survive if you get this job.
Yeah, I mean, but we see that constantly. Like, people are willing to go the extra mile for Hans all the time, and they will respect him, and
because he's always doing it.
He's always doing it.
Even in this place where everybody is terrified of what Hitler is going to do, what's going to happen next, even people who have gone out of their way to join the Nazi Party, and probably, at least to an extent, actually believe some of the rhetoric, want to be supportive of Hans because they've seen the way he is all the time, offering to repaint somebody's house when something bad happens to it, especially when it's vandalized by the party because of a Jewish family. Stopping to help people up, literally being unable to make himself join the party when it's the best thing for his family's survival and safety, simply because he, on an intrinsic level, cannot agree with anything it stands for.
That's one of the...
That and his best friend was a Jew, but...
That too. But that's one of the things that's so great about Death as a narrator, is that Death is the only truly neutral party, especially during World War II. And I know some people right now are probably screaming Switzerland, but Switzerland didn't like Hitler, necessarily, or maybe they did, I don't remember. The point was, though, they were aggressively neutral. It's not the same.
Yeah,
they were neutral because no one wanted to cross their borders.
Going out of your way to try to be neutral is not neutrality. That's being the cranky old man on the cabin in the woods. Yeah, stay off my property. I've got nothing to do with your rock music and your glamping.
Yeah, it's I won't.
That's the voice of Switzerland now.
Bother me. But Death is not dispassionately, but has the disconnect. Death is truly neutral because Death is the only being that truly interacts equally without bias for both sides.
With all of this,
does the job, and that makes Death the perfect narrator for this, because there's no sugarcoating it. There's no agenda. He's not trying to show us that the Nazis are evil or the Germans are evil. He's not trying to show us that the English were heroes or the Allies were heroes or whatever. Death is just showing us that people are flawed and confusing and disturbing and violent, but also that there's a lot of good in there too. He is showing us that the actions of one violent lunatic were horrific, not just for his enemies, but for Germany as well, and the people living under his rule. People were terrified. I mean, yeah, a lot of people bought into Hitler's rhetoric as well. Don't get me wrong.
But an equally big chunk of the people who fought for Germany or were even members of the party, possibly, depending on how generous the world is, maybe even a bigger piece of all those people simply felt like they had no choice or were afraid of what would happen if they didn't.
And by the same token, right, the Allied bombings of these civilian targets of cities where non-combatants, children, live and have nothing to do with the war directly, even. It was a travesty. It was horrific.
There are no good guys or bad guys in war. Well, there are bad guys in war. There are no good guys in war. Yeah,
a war is almost always a battle between the bad guys and the worst guys. There's very little justification. And it's like, yeah, Hitler had to be stopped. Like, the war had to be fought. No one's going to disagree with that.
We get to, in this very book, we get to watch a harmless little hamlet not inhabited by even a single soldier get razed to the ground by bombs.
Yeah, the civilian, and Death sort of says, brings it to your attention, and he's not waxing poetical or whatever. When Death talks about it, Death is asking a question. Death is saying, maybe these people were complicit because plenty of them watched the parades of the Jewish being walked to Dachau. Yeah. Plenty of them abused and vandalized. Many of them bought into the rhetoric, but many of them didn't. And even if they were complicit, they weren't fighting the war. Did they deserve this? Does their deaths and the alleged push to finally get rid of this horrible tyrant that's causing all this, does it justify what has been done to these innocent people, non-combatants, civilians, children?
Yeah, because that's where death is invested. Death doesn't care, isn't even completely cognizant of the politics, the greater politics, I should say, like the why the countries do what they do, what the leaders are thinking and doing at that moment.
Yeah, he doesn't
What
understand
Death
us.
sees is the results that directly affect it or them or whatever you want to call Death, and Death's job, because Death has to take all those people. Death has to meet and see all these people, the bits and pieces of their stories that make it clear just how little sense it made how and when they found their way to it.
Yeah, I said earlier on in this episode, very early on, that you have to wonder why Death is telling us this story. And I talked a little bit about it, but like the major conclusion I have is that Death just wants us to think. Just as much as Death wants to understand us, Death wants us to think about things and do things more the way Death wants things, or would see the world too. Death is saying, like, I am the objective, neutral party. This is what I see, and all of you terrify me.
That's what's happening. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, Death is telling us the story because Death is saying, this is what you look like to me. And whilst I like some of you and dislike some of you, by and large, I deal with humanity at a very non-personal level, because I can't deal with it at a personal level. And I don't understand what I see, and in Death's word, haunts him.
Yeah. The thing that people act like they're haunted by and can't stop thinking about, that is metaphorically always looming over our shoulders, is in fact haunted by us. It's such a good line.
Yeah, it's like, again, it's the final line in the book, and it sticks with you.
Yeah, it does.
Because, yeah, I mean, Death has witnessed everything. Death has seen humanity at our best and our worst. And the only judgment Death can make is that I don't understand and it bothers me.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes
It's
you think about humanity quite a lot.
It's ultimately not a moral stance. I don't like not understanding this. I'm confused, and that's annoying.
Yeah, I mean, as Death would say, like, how could they possibly take a moral stance when they've worked for all the worst dictators in the world?
Yeah, exactly. It's
not by choice, but because it's their purpose. They are Death. They are inevitable. It's what they have to do. They are the only one that can do it.
Who is doing it or why people are being sent to them, their job remains the same.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good, guys.
It's really good. It's a great book. A great movie. Recommended to me by my wonderful, lovely Ghoul Shark, by the way, for whom it is their favorite book.
Hey, shout out to Ghoul Shark.
That's right.
Yes, that is a username. No, don't look it up.
But you can look up Goblin Sharks. They're cool and weird.
They are cool and weird. But yeah, like, that's the thing, right? We've done our job for the most part, I think. Like, we've focused on the perspective stuff, on the narration stuff, as we should. But because of that, I feel like whilst we have very much have impressed upon you how good this book is, there's still so much more we could talk about if we were taking this from a broader perspective, right? Like, every character is so well written and believable and interesting. You want to know more about why these people do what they do and think the things they think. We haven't even touched on Max.
No, Max is an extremely interesting character too. I love Max.
Max is the Jewish man who Liesel's foster family end up harboring.
the Jewish fist fighter,
Yeah, the Jewish fist
as
fighter.
Death likes to tell us every single time he brings him up.
Yeah, well, I
Like,
mean, because Death
it's
finds Max
it's such a
amusing in a
strong
very
part of
different
his
way.
identity. Yeah, it's such a strong part of his identity. Death literally labels Max the Jewish fist fighter because those are the two strongest cores of at least who he is in relation to the story. Because obviously, being a Jew in Nazi Germany is pretty relevant to your life experience, and it's Max liked to get in fistfights a lot.
And he is a survivor and a scrapper by nature,
He's
which
a tough
is
guy.
why it's part of why it's so crushing for him to be holed up in this basement. But it's not. But the thing is, well, like the story never reduces him to just a plot device or anything like that. Yes, he's
No,
the
it
Jewish
never lets him
fistfighter,
just
but he's
become
also kind and compassionate and creative, and
yeah.
he starts exploring himself as a burgeoning artist. Even like he starts getting into that as a method of freeing the mind because the body's restrained.
Yeah, and I really like how they do that because especially in a story that in a story that takes place in Nazi Germany, it would be all too easy to boil down the one main character who is a Jew to his role being the Jew. He's the one who has to hide in the basement, the one who nobody can know about, and who had to run away from home because he's Jewish. But he's so much more without letting the importance of the fact that he is Jewish slip away, not just to the practical reality of what it means for him and the Hubermans as he's hiding with them, but also to who he is, because they talk to us about Max's family and his experience with them and how they sent him off, kind of almost putting all their hopes on and dreams on sending him to get away and like be free and live through all this.
And I mean, the guilt is crushing him because you remember he's the fist fighter, the survivor, the scrapper. He is a fighter by nature. So to flee and leave them behind, that's what haunts Max, and that is
Yeah.
explored so well, both by how Liesel interacts with him and the just beautiful friendship they have, but also how Death portrays him and talks about the things that Liesel doesn't always see or know. Although she knows a lot, he's very open and honest with her.
Yeah,
And
it's really sweet seeing them get along.
and I mean that's one of the coolest things, right, about the writing in this book is that so many characters it is hammered into you that there's like one or two words that are who they are.
Because that's how Death sees us.
Well, no, not even that. I think it's specifically because it's making another point entirely. Max
That's
might
true.
be the Jewish fistfighter, but Death goes out of his way to show us that he's also all these other things. Ilsa is the mayor's wife, but she's also an incredibly complex and layered character. Liesel is the book thief, but how small a part of her identity is that really?
Yeah, and it makes sense because another thing it's hammered into our head is that Death sees in colors, not the way that we see in colors. Great swaths of color that describe not what something looks like, but what it feels like, and sometimes what it is deep down.
Yeah, I mean, again, like Hans he's the guy with the accordion. The accordion is Hans, is what is beaten into us. But Death is also going out of his way to show us all these other things, and that isn't a choice the narrator is making. That is a choice our very good author is making to show us that we're all just people. It doesn't matter what label you slap on us. Jew, Nazi, fist fighter, German, ally, whatever. He is going out of his way to show us that, yeah, some people are shittier than others, some are outright evil, but people are complicated. That's not a narration choice, that's an author choice. I mean, everything's an author choice, but you know what I mean? Death isn't doing this on purpose, as the character, as the narrator. The author is doing this on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the end of the day, regardless of who it is telling us the story, a person wrote it, and he did a damn good job.
Yeah, a person wrote that, and it was written as something that clearly meant a lot to him, and something that was designed to make you think about things in some familiar ways and some different. It existed, I think, from a meta level, like what the story is. To me, it feels like it's a story about humanity, what we are, the good and the bad, and the stuff that makes no sense. And Death is, again, just the perfect narrator to do that, because Death is the only truly neutral party, the only person who treats everyone the same in the end and touches every life. So making Death the narrator for a story that was written to show us who we are, who humanity is, was just a masterstroke.
Yeah, and it's really not an easy task either, setting up for a metaphysical concept, arguably the biggest metaphysical concept, to be an active and the most conversational character in your story. It is so easy for making Death a character to be hokey or shallow or just ultimately a joke, and he characterizes it so well.
Yeah.
Just such a deeply thoughtful story and perspective.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at some of his other books at some point, I think. For now,
Me
though,
too.
that is about our time, and we have certainly sung this book's praises enough. So, for those of you who are listening to this over at Google Podcast or Spotify or whatever, I also release these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com. You can find not only the podcast there, but also transcripts of the stories that go up for the podcast, and some other writing too, including articles and blogs and soon reviews. There will be, by the time you hear this, actually, there will already be reviews up, well and truly. You can also find me on Twitter at DanielWright7. Yep, still Twitter, and yes, I will keep saying this every episode. I'm also sort of on Blue Sky, where I'm Radford Writes. I'm kind of a ghost there, but I'm trying, really, I am. And of course, you can find John here streaming places.
Yeah, mostly on Twitch for now. Don't want to date the episode too much, but holiday rush is going on in the world right now, so I haven't been streaming lately, but the second things calm down a little bit, I am going to be doing it at least once a week.
This is episode 11. By the time they hear this, you'll definitely be streaming again.
Oh, you know what? That's an excellent point. Well, now they know.
Now they know, and now they have plenty to think about, so we can leave them to it. Goodbye, audience.
Have fun, and remember, don't look over your shoulder, because Death's really not watching you that closely.
You enjoy all those thoughts about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust.